Okay, for a demonstration of the Perfetto output, I'm going to just go over and give you a high-level view of the code that we'll be profiling. This is just a little toy code called transpose. It is a multi-threaded HIP application. Essentially, we have three main functions: check HIP error, verify, and run. And then we have our kernel, which essentially just loads some data into shared memory and writes it back out to another matrix. So the pseudocode for this toy application is essentially in verify. We just do some data comparison to make sure that our output data is the same as our input data. And in our run function, we start off by allocating some data. We generate random data on the host. Then we copy that host data to the device. There's a thread barrier. So once all the threads reach this barrier, then they start. And they, for a loop over a number of iterations, they launch the kernel, check whether or not there was any errors in the kernel, and at specified intervals it synchronizes the stream that this kernel is launched on. Then when we finish all those iterations, we do one last stream synchronization. We copy the data back to the host, synchronize that stream, verify it, and delete the data. And from the main, we just have a loop over threads where we create a stream for each invocation of run. Then we call run for each one of those threads. We wait for the threads to finish. And then for all the devices, we just synchronize the device and reset it. Okay, here's the configuration file that I'm using for our instrumentation example. I set the Omnitrace output path to demo output. A lot of familiar things here. Omnitrace used Perfetto and timemory run, same with rock tracer and ROCm-SMI. I enabled sampling and thread sampling, and I also enabled critical trace. I increased the sampling frequency to 100 interrupts per second. I limited the sampling CPUs to just the first four CPUs. And then I specified that the ROCm-SMI devices that I want should look up the environment variable HIP visible devices. And if that environment variable is not set, then it will just include all the devices. Additionally, I specified the hardware counters for the total number of instructions, the floating point instructions, and the vectorization instructions. I have a total of 8 GPUs, but I'm only going to run with 4 threads. So I am going to set HIP visible devices equal to now let's run without instrumentation, and we are going to specify that we want 4 threads, and we are going to run 500 iterations, and we are going to do a stream synchronization every 50 kernels. Okay, as you can see, this application took about 42 seconds. So based on this output, let's go ahead and decrease the minimum number of instructions to include check hip error and potentially these unique locks and vector. So let's set that to 16. Okay, so you can see that now the instrumented functions will be check hip error, run, unique lock, and place back, vector, and verify. Okay, let's remove the simulation parameters and let's execute the binary instrumentation. Okay, now let's export our Omnitrace configuration file. And execute with the same parameters as before. Let's look at our high-level output real quick, just to get an idea of what we should expect to see in our Perfetto output. Okay, you can see we have our main function. There's a bunch of calls to pthread read-write lock, the write lock with high call counts. We have a pthread create. We see our run, setting the device, hit malloc, base sync, our kernels. We have our check hip error, verify, etc. So all the functions we were interested in show up here. Let's take a look at the sampling wall clock also. You can see from the sampling wall clock we have some internal calls that are showing up from Omnitrace. And further down we see the hip launch kernels, the stream destroys, some HSA AMD functions. We see within run we see these calls to rand, which is from generating the random data on the host, and various other internal calls for hip and pthread. Okay, we've navigated to ui.perfetto.dev in our browser. Let's open up that Perfetto output file. Okay, in the first row here, we see all the data from the instrumentation that happens on the main thread. From our restriction to the first 4 CPUs, we see the CPU frequency sampled at various rates. We see the memory usage and the virtual memory usage. From our ROCm SMI sampling, we see the busy percentage, the memory usage in megabytes, the power in kilojoules, and the temperature in degrees Celsius. We see that for GPU 0, GPU 2, 4, and 6, which were the device numbers that we specified in the hip visible devices. Okay, we also see the floating point instructions sampled along a timeline. Anytime you see this S right here, that means this value is derived from a sample. So the resolution of this data is dependent on how high your sampling rate is. We see that for all the different threads. So we have thread 0, thread 2, 3, 4, and 5. In the omni.rocktracer row, this is the data we get from rocktracer first. So this is the kernel execution. This is data that these are runtimes that happen on the device. Okay, if we click on any of these kernels, we see a flow event to the, if it's kernel launch, we see the flow event to the HIP launch kernel, or whatever HIP function is responsible for launching the event on the GPU. For our HIP mem copy async, you see this connected to the copy hosted device. Okay, and down below, for thread 3, 4, and 5, we see our instrumentation for the 3 other threads, aside from the main, that were instrumented. And we see the various HIP kernel launches. Basically there are 50 of these, and then eventually with that stream synchronize, another 50 kernel launches, stream synchronize, and all of these correlate to a kernel launch within this omni.rocktracer row. And you see the after each kernel launch, you see the HIP get last error function call. Okay. Now, the benefit of enabling both instrumentation and sampling is, for example, we have this very large area right here within run where it's not exactly clear what is happening within run that's taking all this time. If we scroll down and we look at the sampling data, which has the parentheses S sampling data, these are the call stack samples for run at that time, and we can see that run is within that region within run we are calling rand, which calls random, which calls a lower level function rand_r, and occasionally there's a pthread set cancel type, which is just a function which sets whether or not a thread can be interrupted. Now, theoretically, if we were to do a runtime instrumentation, we could instrument rand and actually see it in the profile in the region where we have instrumentation. But ultimately the issue is that because instrumenting relatively lightweight functions like rand can bloat the runtime, the overall runtime, and skew it towards making it appear that rand is a higher percentage of the overall runtime than it actually represents. So by using this combination of binary rewrite plus sampling, we are actually able to focus on the functions that we have optimization control over while still getting information back about what third-party functions are filling in the spaces in the runtime between our instrumentation. So an excellent example of this phenomenon is a simple little code that I have here that for a specified number of iterations, computes a Fibonacci several times. And in the output that you see right in front of you, I was able to run the Fibonacci calculations on a single thread 10 times, and the entire runtime took less than 150 milliseconds. Okay, when I basically enabled instrumenting the Fibonacci function, which is a lightweight function like rand, that is called a lot of times like rand in that last example, I was not able to run it 10 times. I could only run it 2 times because the number of calls that were, or the number of instrumentation calls caused the runtime to bloat up to 3.5 seconds or so. And the size of this file went from just a couple of kilobytes to 173 megabytes. And that's not even including the sampling.